Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Ray from the Bloomfield Public Library. I'm going to turn the mic over to you, Jeffrey, for Opera Talk.
Thank you, Sarah, and good afternoon, and welcome to La Boheme. Wait a minute. That's not the beginning of La Boheme. Maybe I put in the wrong CD. Why don't we try this one? I'm doing funny things in my old age. Oh, that sounds better, or it should to you. The thing is that first excerpt was also La Boheme, but by a different composer. So that in effect we have two La Bohemes. Let's say if La Boheme was a person, you might say that one Boheme says to the other, I'm a brother of a different mother. We have two composers who are going to write this opera at the same time, or their operas at the same time. And it'll become pretty much an intense rivalry. The first one is that of Ruggero Leoncavallo, better known as the composer of Pagliacci. And his opera would be premiered about a year and a half after Puccini's, and I wouldn't say has completely disappeared. It only came to America in 1960, but I've read that you can hear it in Italy, and that really it maybe deserves a better fate. It's just been buried by Puccini's, which is one of the most popular operas ever written. So we have these two Bohemes, and this comes about when Leoncavallo, who also wrote his own opera libretti, I think there are at least 7 of his 20 or so operas where he wrote his own libretti, and was a young man. He's born in 1857, Puccini a year later, 1858. And he was brought to the attention of Puccini by his publisher, Ricordi, Giulio Ricordi, very powerful, influential, important music publisher in Italy. And early on, Ricordi told Puccini, in essence, to keep his mouth shut. If you're working on an opera, you don't tell anybody, because someone is liable to steal it away from you, which may have been the case with these two Bohemes. Now, let's go back a bit. And actually, even before we get to that, I did want to talk about operatic twins, which is another way to refer to these two. We do have other operas where you have one that became very successful and then had a twin that sort of fell by the wayside. Now, I'm going to start with the 18th century and a librettist by the name of Pietro Metastasio. He's born in 1698 in Rome and dies in Vienna in 1782. Long life. Up till 1730, he's based in Italy, and then he's offered the position of court poet in Vienna, which he accepts, and remains in Vienna the rest of his life. Now, despite having such a long life, he only wrote 27 libretti. But they were used by everybody. These were libretti that dominated the 18th century and well into the 19th century, mainly classical themes, Dido and Aeneas, Mozart's La Clemenza di Tito, etc. So that you have over 300 composers using these 27 libretti. Haydn didn't use any. Composer we're going to mention in a moment, Gluck, did use some. And I'm going to exclude this category because, of course, you're going to have lots of brothers and sisters because of these 27 libretti. But if we take a composer, for example, like Gluck, Christoph Willibald Gluck, major 18th century, second half of the 18th century, opera composer, best known for his Orfeo. Was born in 1740, dies in 1787. Bohemian born, but will wind up at the court of Vienna and will have a position at court. Wasn't really court composer. And when he dies in 1787, his position passes on to Mozart, who got paid only a third of what Gluck had been paid. And until 1773, he only wrote Italian opera. He would write a total of about, if I counted correctly, 47, quite prolific. And he's invited to Paris to compose French operas, and it'll be a contract for 7 French operas. Now, he'll go there end of 1773, and he'll have a great success. One of those operas will be a French version of Orfeo. And invited as well, later on, will be an Italian composer by the name of Niccolo Puccini. Was born in 1728 and dies in 1800. And the only thing we remember about him today, if we even remember this, is he wrote 128 operas. And it was the brainchild of the intendant or the director of l'Opéra in Paris, who thought it wouldn't be fun to have a competition between these two major opera composers, despite the fact that Gluck specialized in dramatic or tragic opera, and Puccini specialized in opera buffa. And Puccini accepts the invitation, and they're given the same subject, Iphigénie en Tauride. Now, they didn't know each other prior to this, and one of the conductors of the opera, Pierre Berton, decided to have a dinner with them together, and apparently they got on very well. I don't think there was much contact between them afterwards. And then they both would set to work on their Iphigénie operas. The problem wasn't that they've considered themselves rivals. It's that the factions around them considered them rivals. And the factions was like open warfare. You had the Gluckiste, and if I can pronounce it correctly, the Picciniste. And there was a war of words which the French loved. There had been the Guerre des Bouffons in the 1750s, and this is a specialty of France. But the two of them really didn't consider this a rivalry. Now, Gluck will produce his opera in 1779, and it'll be a triumph. And it'll go on to be one of his most often performed operas, well after his death. Puccini's comes 2 years later, and it's well received. It gets over 30 performances, but as time went on, it really did disappear. That's one example of twins, and a good example of two composers aware that one or the other is writing an opera on the same theme. We go to Mozart and Don Giovanni. There is a second Don Giovanni. It's the first Don Giovanni by, I always forget his first name. It's, I think, Giuseppe Gazzaniga. He was born 1743, dies in 1818, the composer of some 50 operas. And in early 1787, his opera is produced rather successfully and will continue to be performed throughout the rest of the century and then pretty much disappear. His librettist would be Giovanni Bertati. Now, along comes Mozart and his librettist Da Ponte, And Da Ponte was well aware of this other opera, and in fact, I don't know if the word stole is the right word, but would take certain parts of the libretto and use it for his own Don Giovanni, which will be premiered in October of 1787 in Prague. It was actually commissioned by Prague. It was a huge success in Prague. Didn't do as well in Vienna, but it would remain in the repertory throughout the 19th century, even though Mozart as a whole wasn't the most popular of composers, the most often performed of composers like he is today. He's going to have a renaissance in the 20th century. But Don Giovanni, Figaro, Magic Flute pretty much hold the stage for him. So we have two Don Giovannis. Mozart and Gazzaniga never met, by the way. And then we have the Barber of Seville, and there are two Barbers of Seville. Rossini's is the second. The first by Giovanni Paisiello. Paisiello was born in 1740, dies in 1816, and composed some 92 operas. Incredible totals, all these. And in 1776, he's invited to the court of Catherine the Great up in St. Petersburg, and will remain there for some 8 years. And in 1782 produces the first Barber of Seville, which is a huge success and spreads all over Europe, equally very successful. Till we come to Rossini, some point end of 1815, early 1816, and he decides to do another version of it. Now it's believed, and this is a bit vague even in the best of biographies of Rossini, it seems that Rossini did write to Paisiello, who's still alive, and asks his permission to set another Barber of Seville, saying that he doesn't want to challenge the prior one or write a better one. He just wants to take a different take on it. And it seems Paisiello wrote back and gave his blessing. So I believe it's February of 1816, we have the premiere of Barber in Rome, which was one of the great fiascos in operatic history. In part, the singers weren't the greatest. Then there were a number of mishaps on stage. But even worse, you had a pro-Paisiello faction in the audience, and they were there to ensure that the opera would fail. And they booed and hissed and catcalled and laughed at the mishaps that they actually thought was part of the stage production. And Rossini was so dispirited that he had conducted that first performance. He went home, wouldn't even conduct the second one. But the second one went much better because that faction had had its success, had made the opera fail at first, and they didn't come. And now it had a better audience. Still only had 7 performances, and it would take a while for the Barber to become as popular as it is today, but it is now one of the great comic operas. The Paisiello, well, you really don't get to hear it, nor maybe should you. So we do have these operatic twins throughout history. There are a couple more, but we should get back to Puccini. So as I said, he's born in 1858. He attends the Milano Conservatory. His principal teacher in composition was Amicare Ponchielli. Doesn't ring a bell. Remember the composer of the tune for Hello Mata, Hello Fada. And he's going to produce his first opera, that's Puccini, in 1884, called Le Villi. And it's a decent success, not huge, critical and public. More importantly, it shows that Puccini has tremendous talent, and it's at this point he's going to get the backing of Giulio Ricordi. And so he is commissioned for a second opera. The first one was not premiered at La Scala, but in a different theater in Milano. But now he gets a La Scala premiere for the second work, which is Edgar. This was a fiasco. It only got 3 performances. And blame was placed on the libretto, which had a great impact on Puccini, because from this point on, he's going to be extremely difficult to work with in terms of with his librettists. He wants everything perfect. He'll have a lot of input into the libretti. So he goes on to his third opera, which is going to be Manon Lescaut. Now, the second opera, Engel, was produced at La Scala. Ricaldi, who would have a great influence on where operas were premiered in which towns, which would be more favorable than others, suggested that they not have another La Scala premiere, too dangerous after having a failure before, that they would have the premiere in Torino, Turin, and this would be at the Teatro Regio, the Royal Theatre, which was becoming or was already one of the main opera houses in Italy, La Scala, San Carlo in Naples, and La Fenice in Venice. And so Manon Lescaut will be premiered February 1st of 1893 and be a triumph. It's his first major success. But before he can get to it, he runs through a number of librettists. First, he has a team of two, and after working with them, he rejects their libretto. Then he receives the libretto from Ruggero Leoncavallo. This is before Pagliacci, and so he was still an unknown figure, known, if he is known, certainly known by Ricaldi, as a librettist as well as a composer. He'd composed two operas, but they hadn't been performed yet. And he's going to provide a libretto, and that's going to be rejected. Somehow, he stays on good terms with Puccini. I get a sense that Leoncavallo wasn't terribly liked by Puccini and Ricaldi at the beginning. And no one comes out and says it, but there are hints of it in various biographies of Puccini, and there isn't a biography of Leoncavallo, unless it just came out recently. So he rejects his libretto, and then he is teamed up with Luigi Illica. He's born in 1857, dies in 1918, and he was a professional librettist, still young. He would go on to write some 35 libretti. Later on, he would team up with another librettist for Puccini and produced La Boheme, Tosca, and Madame Butterfly. And this works out. This is better teamwork. And he will be the final librettist. He'll pull, I guess, all these different versions together or take parts of them. And Manon Lescaut is produced, and very successfully, on February 1st. Now, so while he was writing Manon Lescaut, and this was typical of Puccini, he would be thinking of the next project. And in the case of, he's working on Manon Lescaut, his first idea, believe it or not, was an opera about Buddha. And we know about this because in 1890, he writes to his brother and says, I'm going to do an opera based on the life of Buddha. But that's the last we hear of it. So that obviously had been shelved. It might have been the influence of Ricaldi. Why he was attracted to Buddha, we all know that Puccini liked the exotic, and that might fall into that category. Comes up with another idea, another work, and this was called La Lupa, or The She-Wolf. And it was a short story by Giovanni Verga. And if you tuned into La Sonnambula, I made reference to him in that Bellini came from Catania in Sicily, and so did Verga. And Verga was one of the, call him instigators, in the Verismo or realism movement. So it began as a literary movement, and then it became a musical movement, Puccini being part of it. And Verga wrote a collection of short stories, one being La Lupa, another being Cavalleria Rusticana, which was then dramatized and then turned into an opera by Mascagni, premiered in 1890, which set off the career of Mascagni and set off Verismo in music. So this is apparently a rather unpleasant story, but Puccini was intrigued by it and goes down to Sicily to meet Verga. And he would do what he did with so many of his operas. Part of this realism was to use let's say, a country or a town or a people in his operas and make it as realistic as possible. For instance, in Turandot, he uses actual Chinese melodies. In Girl of the Golden West, he uses American folk song. In Tosca, he wanted the bells of St. Peter, the exact same tones of those bells, to be heard at the beginning of Act 3. So it made sense for him, even at this early stage, to go down to Sicily, where apparently he had never been before, get a sense of the countryside, the architecture. He took a lot of photos, the native costumes, the people, because Verga's tales were about Sicilian life, and particularly the lower levels of society. So he spends some time there. He also meets with Verga. And then he takes a ship back to Leghorn, which is near his home in Torre del Lago. And on board was the Countess Blandine Grevina. I think I've got that right. And she was the daughter of Cosima Wagner. Before Cosima married Wagner, it was her child with the conductor and pianist Hans von Bülow. And Puccini heard that she was on board and was very eager to meet her. Puccini, who was very much interested in contemporary music, and Wagner in Italy was considered contemporary music. Wagner's born in 1813 and is producing operas by the early 1840s, even before some earlier ones. Bayreuth opens in 1876, but he's only heard in Italy for the first time in the early 1870s. And he was very slow to get to the stages of Italian theaters. So this was new music, and Puccini was fascinated by it. So he wanted to meet the girl. So he would sit at the piano in the big ballroom, I guess, start playing excerpts from Tannhäuser. That caught her attention. And he was invited over to sit down and have a chat with her. And one of her questions was, well, what's your next project? And he said, oh, I'm going to set La Lupa by Verga to music, and then described the story, which is this horrific murder of a woman on Good Friday during a procession, etc. And she said, oh, that sounds absolutely horrible. You should do something less lurid, less unpleasant. And she may have planted the seed in his head to abandon La Lupa, because by the time he gets back to Torre del Lago, now he is thinking about different subjects, and he is thinking about La Boheme. And it's around 1892 that he is going to commit himself to that subject. Now, there's some wondering as to how did he come to the subject of La Boheme. And first of all, La Boheme was initially a novel by a French author with a Germanish name, named Henri, but with a Y, Murger, and an umlaut over the U. True Parisian, born there in 1822, dies in 1861. His father was German, was a concierge and tailor, and it was considered a bit exotic to add a Y to, Henri, or to have an umlaut on your name. One reason we believe he did that. And he had very little education. He became rather self-educated. And he's starting to write by 1841. He's dabbling in journalism. And between 1845 and 1848, he has this novel produced serially. It was a literary journal called Le Corsaire, entitled Scènes de la vie de Bohème. And it's rather autobiographical. He led the life of a bohemian, had very little money, had grave consequences on his health. One reason he died at the age of 38. And he had a group of friends, and they would, munch off of each other or lend each other clothes, etc., just like in his opera, or in Puccini's opera. And it'll have a certain success with its publication. It'll be published then in book form, and then have a huge success when it is dramatized in 1849. And now suddenly he has money, so that's helpful, but unfortunately the money can't help his health, so he will pass away so young. So it's on this work that Leoncavallo and Puccini are going to base their operas. Now, there are two theories as how he came to know the work, Les Scènes. The first, it may have come through his librettist, Luigi Illica. Illica, who had apparently an immense library of French literature. Of course, he worked on the libretto of the novel that was based on the novel of the Abbé Prévost, Manon Lescaut. And it is very possible that he suggested it Puccini. The other is that Leoncavallo didn't follow the advice that Ricaldi had given to Puccini, and inadvertently had told Puccini, because they did know each other, that he was working on a La Boheme, and so that might have planted the seed. Now, it's in 1894, so it's a year after Manon Lescaut, and he's now working on Boheme, and he meets Leoncavallo in a Milanese cafe, and Puccini lets out that, oh, I'm working on an opera based on the story of La Boheme. Leoncavallo suddenly turns into Mount Vesuvius and explodes, but I told you that I was thinking of doing that work. And in fact, something I omitted, that previously Leoncavallo had done a libretto or a very detailed scenario for the opera and had showed it to Puccini, hoping he would hire him as a librettist, but Puccini had rejected it. So now he is furious because Puccini had shown no interest, and yet now he's stolen the subject from him. And then the next day, there would be in the daily paper published that Leoncavallo is working on an opera entitled La Boheme, and in the Corriere della Sera, famous afternoon paper, it would state that Puccini is working on the same opera. And Puccini would say to Leoncavallo, well, look, I'm going to work on my opera, you work on your opera, and we'll let the public decide. So it was left at that. After that, their relationship was quite strained, as it would be with Mascagni. So we're going to have the premiere of La Boheme once again at the Reggio, Teatro Reggio in Turin. The reason being, now he'd had the success of Manon Lescaut, but Verdi hadn't finished yet. He was preparing to present Falstaff, and that's going to be premiered on February 9th of 18... Oh, so that was back in Manon Lescaut, I'm sorry, I'm getting my operas confused. That's the reason that they went to the Teatro, the second reason they went to the Teatro Reggio was because Falstaff was being premiered at La Scala. And because they had such a great success in Turin, they decided to have the premiere of La Boheme, which will be conducted by Toscanini, young Toscanini. Now, this was not, as you might imagine, or you would imagine it would have been, a huge success. It was well received in parts, but not a colossal success. And there were some reasons for it. The Mimi was Cerisa Ferrani, who had been the first Manon Lescaut, and apparently she was all right. But the Rodolfo was not all right. And they had to transpose much of the opera so he could get through it. Marcello, the first Marcello, was apparently completely inept, and shortly before the performance they changed Marcellos, and apparently the second one was, if not as bad, even worse, and we can take it from Puccini, who would refer to him as the dog. So the singing wasn't great. At the end of Act 1, Puccini only got 3 curtain calls, whereas Manon Lescaut would get a total of 30. End of Act 2, I don't have number of curtain calls, but it did not go over well with the public. Neither did Act 3. But the public warmed up with Act 4, and Puccini would get a total of 15 curtain calls, which sounds like a lot, but is only half as many as Manon Lescaut. And it'll take some time for the opera to become very popular. Now, it's going to come to La Scala in 1897, and then heard again for the season 1900-1901, and then not heard there until 1916. After that, it'll become more of a repertory work. As far as America is concerned, it's going to be first heard not in New York but in Los Angeles, and then it premieres at the Met in 1900, comes back in 1903, and for the next 50 years is heard every season, which is quite stunning. So that from 1900 till 1987, when my source book ends, at the Met it will receive some 631 performances. That's just 20 less than Aida, but keep in mind that Aida got its premiere at the Met in 1886, so it had a head start. By 2017, it's had over 1,200 performances at the Met to make it the most often performed opera there. At l'Opéra Comique, it goes through a period, in Paris of course, a period of 50 years where it gets 1,000 performances. And some of you may have seen, I didn't see the production, I've only seen photos of it, but this what seems to have been a brilliant production by Franco Zeffirelli, where he had in the second act, the cafe scene, 2 levels on stage. So you had people below on one level and people above, the street level. And that was premiered in 1981, and by 1917 that production alone had over 500 performances. So we are talking about a very popular opera. Now, as far as plot goes, some of you know I hate going into plots. In La Boheme, I think everybody knows the plot. If you don't know the plot of La Boheme, you know the plot of Rent, which is a modern version of it. Very briefly, you have Rodolfo, a poet, and Rodolfo was actually to represent Henri Merget. He was an editor of a literary journal, as well as being a writer. And Rodolfo is not very well off. He's sharing a garret with 3 other people. One is a painter, Marcello. Another is a musician, Chonard. And the 4th is a philosopher, Colline. In the opera by Leoncavallo, it's not Rodolfo who's the main character, it's Marcello. And he switches the voice types also. Marcello is the tenor, and Rodolfo is the baritone. So in Act 1, you have them cavorting in the apartment. They have a confrontation with the landlord. They don't have money to pay him. And Chonard comes in with some money. He's been hired to play the piano to kill a parrot. Just keep playing it until the parrot drops dead. But the parrot wouldn't drop dead, so a maid had to feed it partially, and then it did drop dead. And so he was paid for his services. So everybody decides to go out and celebrate. They go to the Café Momus, which will be in Act 2. Rodolfo stays behind for a few minutes, and there's a knock on the door, and it's his neighbor, who I guess he hasn't met so far, named Mimi. She sells artificial flowers, or she's a seamstress. Again, depends on the scenario you read. And she's come to borrow a cup of sugar. Of course, she's given the cup of sugar. She leaves. Then we have another knock on the door. She's dropped her key, and they try to find the key. It's sort of semi-dark in the room. And their hands touch, and you have one of the most famous sighs in all of opera. You hear her go, and this leads to a double aria. I don't think there's another example of this in opera, where you have one character singing a major aria, and immediately followed by the other character singing an aria quite different from the first. And First it's Rodolfo, who sings about her frozen little hands, and then her introduction, my name is Mimi. And so I thought we'd listen to the two arias back to back. This is probably the finest recording. This is with Pavarotti and Mirella Freni as the hero and heroine. And here we go.
Per sogni
Exquisite singing. That's very young Pavarotti, 1973. Equally very young Freni. And kind of an amusing story, in 1976, Pavarotti was asked to do Boheme at the Met during a season when Boheme wasn't scheduled. So it was a gala performance. And opposite him was Montserrat Caballé, who was a great soprano in voice and in size. And after he sang his aria, and of course she's supposed to start singing right away, and the audience goes crazy, Caballé stood up and applauded him. Apparently got the greatest laugh of the evening, but acknowledging that this was just exquisite singing. What else can you say? One thing I didn't talk about, I should add still, we have a collaboration of 4 people on this opera. I mean, the opera would just seem so effortless, flows so effortlessly, dramatically and musically. But this was quite a struggle. And Alica and Ricaldi, who had a lot of input into libretti, I said he was very influential, would bring in Giuseppe Giacosa. He was born 1847, dies in 1906, who was not really a librettist. He only did 3 for Puccini, and then he did 1 for another opera and then a text for an oratorio. He was a playwright, and he was one of the foremost dramatists of the second half of the 19th century in Italy. Highly respected. He taught at the conservatory. He also had a journal that was very popular and successful. He wrote some 32 plays. And he was of this Verismo school, of the Verga school. Verga and he were really the two leaders of the movement. And so he's called in, and he was kind of the peacemaker. You had Puccini, who would get really angry and irritated with what was being presented to him. Alica, who was also rather high-strung. And then you had let's say, Puccini would describe as the Jocosan Buddha. Apparently he looked like a Buddha, was short, very round, had a huge pot belly, had a beard, which isn't very Buddha-like, but he also had a very meditative look. It was very calm, it would keep things calm. But there was quite a struggle to put this libretto together, and Giacosa, in fact, would say that he would use more paper on one scene of Boheme than he would use in an entire play that he would write. Just had to rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. But in the end, it all came together. To conclude, I'm going to use the duet at the end of Act 1 and play you two different versions. It's a great moment because it ends with a high C. Not too many acts do. Il Trovatore Manrico sings a high C to end the act, but and in Siegfried we have Brunhilde singing a high C to end the act, but it's not often you hear it. Those two are a little more exciting. This is much more lyrical. But I've got two versions, one where the tenor doesn't do the high C, and then the other the tenor does, and I think you hear it's a great difference, much more exciting with the high C. The first version is with one of the great tenors of his day, Jussi Björling, a Swedish tenor, born 1911, dies very suddenly young in 1960, and was famous for his rather smooth and velvety voice. Apparently he had the high notes, it shouldn't have been a problem, and he had a powerful voice. It's odd he doesn't take it here, and also I have a recording of him in Turin, where he sings opposite Birgit Nilsson. And there is a moment in Act 2 where Puccini writes in an alternative phrase, one that has the high C and the other that doesn't, and he doesn't take the high C, which is a pity because it's rather exciting, getting that high C out of nowhere. So we'll listen first to Björling, and then I'll tell you who the second one is when we get to him. O Suave Fanciulla. Bad pronunciation on my part.
O suave fanciulla.
Sadly, I can't tell you who the soprano is. I discovered a stack of CDs, 50 great moments in opera, and they do cite U.C. Bierling, but they don't cite who the soprano is, and there's no leaflet, so it's a mystery. Now, for the second version, you're going to hear a very familiar voice introducing the two singers. And, of course, the tenor does take the high C. I'm so pleased I found this. It was kind of strange. I'd ordered a recording of this tenor singing in the Requiem of Verdi, and then it's a two CD set. There were all these other excerpts from some of live performances of his, and this is one of them, and it's a thrilling sound at the end. Maybe you can guess who it is. Well, no, it's going to be announced at the beginning, so much for that.
Back in November 1953 from the Metropolitan Opera House, we presented the thrilling Metropolitan Opera story with Rudolph Bing as narrator. And on that night, almost 13 years ago, the singers were Merrill, Tucker, Sieppe, Reza Stevens, and Roberta Peters. And later, with Mr. Bing as narrator, Dmitri Metropolis conducting, we presented Maria Callas as Tosca with George London. Tonight, we have the great privilege of presenting on our stage Metropolitan stars Dorothy Kirsten and Franco Corelli, and this excerpt from La Boheme. So let's have a fine welcome for these great artists.
Dammi le braccio mia piccina.
Obbedisco, Signor.
Che m'avi
that's the way you end the act, I think. I didn't complete the story. Oh my goodness. Most of you should know it. Second actor in that Café Momus. Musetta sings her famous waltz. Act 3, of course, Rodolfo and Mimi have fallen in love. They've separated because she's dying of consumption. They decided then of the act to move in back together again until the spring. Meanwhile, in the background, you've got this fight between Marcello and Musetta. They're a couple, but she's not being faithful, and blah, 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 blah. And in Act 4, Mimi passes away. That's all you have to know. People, I think, go for the music more than anything else. Next opera will be Richard Strauss's Arabella, not one of his best-known operas. Well, I'll try to make a case for it. It's a late opera. It's the last collaboration with von Hofmannsthal as librettist for some 6 operas beforehand. One of the great partnerships in opera. But he died quite suddenly in the middle of the work. So I hope you'll tune in for Arabella. Sarah.
Thank you, Jeffrey.